Hello, my name's Andy Critchlow. I'm Head of News at S&P Global Commodity Insights, and welcome to the Look Forward podcast from S&P Global. In today's rapidly shifting markets, success depends on anticipating what's next. The professionals who excel are those who can spot emerging trends before they fully materialize. The Look Forward podcast delivers exactly that. Insights to help you prepare for tomorrow's opportunities and challenges. We bring you expert perspectives on macroeconomic trends, capital markets, energy transition, and global trade, with a sharp focus on what these developments mean for the decisions that will shape your tomorrow. This podcast connects you with S&P Global's Look Forward Council, bringing cutting-edge research on long-term trends and transformative market shifts. Together, we're committed to providing the forward-looking intelligence you need to navigate uncertainty with confidence. So, welcome to this episode of Look Forward podcast. My name's Andy Critchlow. I'm Head of News at S&P Global Commodity Insights, and it is my pleasure to be joined today by Carlos Pascual, Senior Vice President for Geopolitics, Global Geopolitics and International Affairs at S&P Global Commodity Insights, and a man who has a CV that actually reads like a character from a Jason Bourne film. Former U.S. ambassador to Mexico, former U.S. ambassador to the Ukraine, Special Assistant to the President of the United States and Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine and Eurasia at the National Security Council, just to name a few of the sort of critically central roles that you've played, Carlos, in the world of geopolitics and international relations. And I guess to kind of open the podcast, we off air, we talked about, this is an angry world. And, I think that certainly few people that we've spoken to on this podcast can really comment on kind of what that means, like you can from your experiences, both in terms of international affairs and your career and now in your role at S&P Global.
Andy, first, thank you for having me on the podcast. It's a pleasure to join you, and thank you for having this conversation. I think this question of anger in the world, of alienation, of polarization, is one that we really have to stare in the face and deal with in a very explicit way. We've faced it for a long period of time where there are groups and people within countries that have felt that they have not had the benefit of rising with economic growth. It's been an issue with globalization. It's been a question about how income is distributed and job opportunities are distributed internally within countries. It's an international issue on how the opportunities globally are spread across countries. And it's an issue that's affected global institutions, the UN, the World Trade Organizations, and others. It's affected their credibility. And now, Andy, I think we face another set of challenges where we've had over the past 8 decades a global international order, fractured as it is with the anger that we've had, that has been focused on the concept of rules, of interdependence, on globalization, to one now driven by the United States, which is focused on being transactional, of doing deals, of being nationalistic. It's make America great again. It's not looking at what is good for the world. And it's protectionist. It's focused around tariffs. As President Trump has indicated, that's his favorite tool. And as a result of that, it puts us into an environment where that transactionalism and the individual negotiations create an environment of breaking apart relationships. Because, Andy, I'm a lot more effective when I'm negotiating with you and breaking you apart from your team than really dealing with it together. And it means that being anti-alliance, anti-agreement is part of that transactional world. So we're now dealing with that added element on top of an angry world and the type of fracturing and polarization that we've had in the past. So great challenges that we're facing economically, politically, in the world of diplomacy.
So you mentioned tariffs and, the transactional nature of the administration under President Trump. We've seen the latest round recently ranging from 10 to 50%, targeting over 60 trading partners. And, it really is a dramatic escalation in, this shift in policy, which you mentioned, this shift towards protectionism. I guess the first thing that I wanted to ask was, how long do you think, what is the transmission period now for this to start to really impact markets, for it to feed through to, people's pockets in terms of inflation, and some of the wider economic impacts that, potentially could be seen by this, this process that you see of the erosion of multilateralism to a more transactional based form of diplomacy and, specifically trade negotiations?
Andy, the impact period begins right now. It began yesterday and the day before. So let's really understand what the implications of that are. As a result of the indication that President Trump had that we would be increasing, the United States would be increasing tariffs, there's a huge import surge into the United States in the first quarter. Over a period of time, over a period of months, the United States has been drawing on those inventories and drawing them down. As a result of that, we didn't see as much of the inflationary impact, the price impact that one might have expected otherwise. But we're coming to the end of that period. We're coming to the beginning of a period where now the United States is at an average of about 18% tariffs. That's the highest level that the United States has had since the 1930s. And so when you think about what that means, some have said, well, think about an 18% tax imposed on all of the imports that are coming to the United States. Because one way or another, you have to charge this or see it reflected, or else the tariffs aren't affected, right? And so is it going to be absorbed by the businesses that are involved? And if they do absorb it, are they then going to be less effective and cash viable? Is their cash flow going to suffer? Or do you pass that through already to the consumer? What we're already beginning to see as far as the inflation statistics in June by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is that we're starting to see some of that pass through in prices. We've also seen a softening in the labor market. It's created its own set of controversies because President Trump fired the head of Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that's become its own internal debate in the United States. But what we need to now understand is that we have a world in which there have been some trade agreements that have been done, but have many exemptions and many questions that need to be settled. The biggest trading relationships in Mexico, in China, in Canada are still not completely set. So we have to understand how that's going to play out. And just thinking about Mexico and Canada, how that affects the integration of the industrial economy of the United States and where it goes into the future. All of those things are going to play out. So, yes, we're going to start to feel it, but in fact, there are a whole series of questions that still are not clear, and we're going to continue to see this play out for many, many months ahead.
Because President Trump's taken a major risk here, pushing through these tariffs in such a way ahead of the midterm elections, especially when, he wasn't voted in to raise prices. It was actually the opposite: reduce prices, reduce inflation. That why do you think he's taken that risk?
Well, I think that President Trump feels that, and rightly so. One of the big issues that was a factor in his reelection was that he called for the reindustrialization of the United States to bring back jobs back to the U.S. and particularly to the midland, to the heart of the United States over time. And so the idea of tariffs is to provide a protective environment that allows American companies to invest in the production of manufacturing in the United States and restrains imports that might be competitive for a period of time. Right. And so the challenge is going to become, how effective is that going to be? How quickly can that come? And in what industries is it going to come? And can you still attract Americans to work in those jobs? or are they jobs that are going to pay such low wages that it's going to be difficult to attract Americans to work in them? We've seen announcements by Apple, for example, of an intent to invest $100 billion in the United States. But what we've also seen is that companies are holding back on investment because they're unsure of the tariff environment, what their costs are going to be. Supply chains have been disrupted because of the tariff environment. And so we have these factors playing themselves out: the intent of reindustrialization, the uncertainty about investments and supply chains. And then finally, the other point that you're raising, Andy, which is that of prices. And inevitably, we're going to see some price rises. Some will argue that it's not inflation, but that it's a one time price rise that you get as a result of these tariffs going up. But here is another issue that President Trump will have to contend with. Just as with Joe Biden, when the price of a gallon of milk went up, he began to control inflation, but the price of that gallon of milk never went down, right? If you have prices that are higher, they're not going to go down going into the future. And how will that play into the midterms? You're putting your finger exactly on some of the economic and political issues that are going to play themselves out over the next year.
So we have the tariffs pillar holding up one side of this scenario, and linked to that prices and the wider picture for the global economy, and then the other pillar to this dynamic of a shifting world from multilateralism to transactional diplomacy is the erosion of these and assault in some ways of these critical intergovernmental organizations which have underpinned so much of the world in post 1945, whether that's the World Bank, the IMF, NATO, and now we're seeing that that's being challenged. But to bring this back to the other side of that equation and to the administration at the same time, the administration has attacked some of the new sort of challenging intergovernmental organizations like the BRICS, which have been incredibly sort of more influential probably over the last 5 years due to their resource-rich economies and the fast-growing economies that they have. If we look at this fragmentation, we look at countries like Brazil and India. How do you see this new sort of reshaping of global governance and energy diplomacy working out for some of these nations?
Good question, Andy. So the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, for everybody to get us on the same page. Brazil currently has the presidency of the BRICS. Just yesterday, President Lula reached out to both China and India and called for a meeting or a conference of the BRICS countries to begin to discuss this issue of American tariffs and how the BRICS countries respond. Brazil has received a 50% tariff. That tariff is very much linked, as President Trump has said, to Brazil's actions with former President Bolsonaro, who's being brought into a Supreme Court hearing for seeking to promote a coup d'etat after he lost his election. Right. So there's a political dimension to this as well as the economic dimension. India has been a key factor. And just yesterday, they saw, on top of a previous 25% tariff, a new tariff of 25% that has been justified by the administration as being imposed because India is purchasing Russian energy products, particularly oil. And as a result of that, is having an impact indirectly on the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine and reaching a ceasefire agreement. And so you get the picture here that for Brazil, for India, for China, where we've known about the trade conflicts, there's one common theme. And the theme that they can unify around is against the hegemony, to use their words, the hegemony of the United States. That is the common purpose that they would have. One of the common elements that they have begun to experiment with is, are there payment mechanisms that they can have in local currency? so that they can avoid the use of the dollar in their transactions and attempt to isolate themselves from being vulnerable to the American banking system. Those have been specific issues that President Trump has been concerned about and has threatened to oppose additional tariffs because of that. The question one has to ask is, do these countries represent a vision of what the world would be, an alternative vision of how it could function and it could operate? China and Russia have said that they would like to offer a different vision that's not based on the American liberal democratic system. But India is still a democracy. Brazil is still a democracy. And so one starts to ask, is there a broader alternative that they offer? That becomes less clear. And what we're beginning to see is that these tariff arrangements can break apart institutions, they can hurt relationships. In the case of India, a good example, a country that was so fundamental to the American relationship in creating a bulwark in Asia against China, now it's in a direct confrontation. So these issues are going to take themselves some time to play out. There is going to be some tension and some conflict. There are going to be the fledglings of alternative relationships. I'm consciously using that word instead of institutions, where countries will want to hedge against their dependence on the United States. But at the same time, the United States will be rich and it will be powerful and it will not disappear. So I think there's going to be a time when we're going to see more confusion rather than actually less.
How does this tip the balance between the US and China? If this was if we're talking about a game here, has China actually turned this to its advantage?
You've hit on a a central question that goes into the world of politics, security, economics, trade, global influence, global images. But I'll bring it back to one example. In May of this year, the United States auto industry raised a flag when Stellantis, GM, and Ford said that they would begin to have to close plants because they cannot get access to rare earths and high powered magnets from China. Without those magnets, they cannot produce an automobile and they would begin to have to close plants. That reality led the United States to call for the tariff negotiations with China after it had increased the tariffs on China to 145%. They needed a truce. And one of the things that we found out afterwards that ended up being part of that deal is that China has been given access again to NVIDIA's H20 chips, which are part of the AI infrastructure. They're not the most high powered chips, but it's an important capability. So, who would have imagined that magnets and China's control of them and AI chips would have become at the center of the trading relationship between the United States and China, and that this can become such a critical geopolitical factor in how the negotiations would go forward? It can go much further, and it gets into issues that are central to energy security, and we can talk about them if you want. But China's dominance in critical minerals, its dominance in batteries, in electric vehicles, in solar panels, in wind turbines, in electrolyzers, are creating a divergence where China is trying to establish itself as the leader in technology dominance going into the future, the United States in energy dominance, specifically defined as hydrocarbons dominance. How are these issues going to play themselves out? In near term energy security, the United States has a critical role as a supplier of hydrocarbons. In terms of the future supply of clean energy and what will be the cheapest energy sources, China's making a big bet that the focus on renewable energies is going to reduce its dependence on hydrocarbon imports and allow it to be a lower cost competitor in the future.
That does conveniently bring us to the third pillar, as I see it, which is the energy transition and the global race for resources. And you mentioned there, China's dominance in some of these key areas. You mentioned as well the U.S. dominance in key areas around fossil fuels. How do you see, though, more broadly, this shift from the multilateral world to a more transactional form of diplomacy impacting, issues around energy security, and as well, the global fight against climate change and the trajectory of energy transition going forward?
Look, I think one of the things that one has to start with a recognition is that the changing nature of the use of types of energy and fuels has to be linked not just to the supply, but also to the demand. And right now, there's still strong demand for hydrocarbons and for oil, and we're going to see that going into the future. And as a result of that, the American capacity to produce significant barrels of oil at a relatively low price will make the United States an important player in global energy security. There's also a reality that over time, we've seen the cost of renewable energies drop dramatically in solar, in wind. It's moving in that direction in electrolyzers. It's being translated into that in electric vehicles. For China, this is not a question of climate change. It's not a question of pollution. It's a question of national security. It was reducing its dependence on the vulnerability of oil and gas transiting through the Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, and potentially having supplies being shut off. When they saw what happened when Russia cut off gas supplies to Europe, they took other measures. Even with everything that they're investing in renewable energy, they increased their investments in coal, even as a standby capacity factor to ensure that they would not be vulnerable if in the future, let's say, there were actions on Taiwan and there were threats against China's access to hydrocarbons in the future. And so what we've seen is that China has taken a comprehensive set of actions on renewable energies, on electric vehicles, on critical minerals, on the production of batteries that have put it in a dominant position on technology going into the future, even on electric vehicles. Our estimate as a company in a study that we did in 2022 was that there would be a growth of about 12 million electric vehicles by the time that by this time right now in 2025. We've surpassed that. It's gone over 16. And the bulk of that difference, 4.1 million of those vehicles of that overproduction, has been in China, to give you a sense of how big it's become. China has already passed peak demand on gasoline. It's going to reach peak demand in oil in the next year and a half, and it's going to become a critical supplier of clean technology to Southeast Asia in particular, which is the highest growing primary energy demand. So these are issues that are going to play themselves out. The United States is not out of this picture on hydrocarbons. There's still a strong, strong market in the United States for clean tech. The incentives of that obviously are changing with the changes in the Inflation Reduction Act. But I think we need to have very wide open eyes on what's happening in China and measures that they're taking, because China today is investing as much in clean technologies as the entire OECD combined.
And the really interesting thing there, you mentioned energy security. It's actual mineral security now, metal security. With the rise of electric vehicles, what are you going to need? You're going to need more metals, specifically aluminum as well as battery metals, but also, really importantly, copper. And I know this is an area that you've taken a great interest in. And can you just kind of explain to us how that will play out?
Andy, this is an issue that is helpful to look at through the lens of artificial intelligence through AI. For both the United States and China, AI again has become a national security issue. It's linked to getting military advantages, defense advantages, and then commercial advantages as well. To advance AI, you need data centers, For data centers to run, they need massive amounts of electricity. In the United States, we've estimated that if you look at the difference between 2024 to 2030, the amount of electricity demand measured in terawatt hours is going to triple, right? To be able to do that, you need copper. Copper is the metal of electrification. You need it in the data centers. You need it for all transmission and distributions. You need it internally within batteries. You need it in electric vehicles. And so now there has arisen another critical question of who wins in this race for AIs. And that race has been critically attached to the ability to supply the energy to drive it, the cost of that energy, and the access to the minerals that are necessary to be able to do it. Today, China has 45% of the processing capacity for copper. The United States cannot process all of the copper that we produce. We export about 45% of it to be processed in other countries. And so that is one of the reasons why, as S&P in a cross-divisional initiative, we're undertaking a study called Copper in the Age of AI, where we're going to look at the demand for it, where the supply is going to come from, where the processing is going to come from, and what are the implications for the future. No one has studied this in the depth that we're about to do so today. But what we can say for certain is that what happens with copper and electrification is going to be critical in who wins the race for AI and how it plays out in the geopolitical race between the United States and China as well.
And that's reflected in the price. If you look at the surging prices of copper recently, certainly over the last year, and you compare that to oil, and one of the things I find fascinating with the amount of geopolitical risk in the market, you mentioned the Gulf, we had the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, some pretty unprecedented events that happened this year around that, and the intervention of the United States. But we didn't get that huge spike in oil prices. Oil prices have been a long way from testing that $147 a barrel record high that we saw back to 2007, under very far more benign sets of circumstances. And it just seems that, when you compare that to some of these critical minerals, some of these battery metals, and you mentioned copper, which is a fascinating story, gets into all these access to resources, a finite supply of that mineral, and this huge rising demand around, AI. I guess to finish, it's one of the kind of pervasive themes of my career as a journalist has been the Carter Doctrine. And I spent a lot of time in the Middle East as a journalist, and this assumption that the US would intervene at any point to protect energy resources out of the Middle East. We saw it in the 12-day war with the bombing of Iran, arguably. But we didn't see it back in 2015 when we had the attacks on Abqaiq. What's changed? And as a final point, does the Carter Doctrine still exist, or is it in a different form?
Doctrine is changing. Global geopolitical realities are changing. Let me take you to one fundamental change that one has to understand in order to understand the dynamics of what's happened in the Middle East and what's happened on oil prices. 2019, China brokered a relationship between, 2020? Now I'm getting my dates mixed up. You'll correct me later on. The point is, China brokered a resumption of diplomatic relationships between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The principal customer for oil coming out of the Gulf is China. That affects Iran. It affects Saudi Arabia. It has to be absolutely clear that China has to have communicated to Iran, we do not want you to block the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, if they block the Strait of the Hormuz, they cannot export oil. China is the principal buyer. It's the principal source of Iran's income. In the meantime, China's principal economic relationship in the Middle East is in Saudi Arabia. China's invested in Saudi Arabia and vice versa. And that dynamic has changed the politics of the Gulf, where in the past, what we have seen that has caused a huge escalation of prices is when the Gulf, where there's 20% of the world's oil, is potentially blocked in supplying international supply. There was no blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. In the pictures that we took in our Mint service, the afternoon afterwards, you can still see the ships flowing. And 1 week later, the drop in actual oil tankers that were flowing out of the Gulf only went down from 324 to 307. The point is, there was a shift and the change in the politics globally within China, Iran, Saudi Arabia that had an impact on the Gulf, that had an impact on prices. And in addition to that, you had another reality, which is shale oil in the United States, the US as a major producer, and all of this happening at a point in time when there were reevaluation of OPEC prices and OPEC even bringing more supply onto the market. So the impact has been that there hasn't been an increase in price. And in fact, when all of that OPEC oil does come onto the market, you're going to see inventories build and price is actually going to come down. A comment real quick on copper. The price of copper surged when there was a belief that there was going to be an American 50% tariff on refined copper. Prices shot up. When that tariff was adjusted from refined copper, which would have been the bulk of copper that goes into the United States, it was focused on semi-finished products. Boom, the price just plummeted overnight, and it's back down to the London Metal Exchange price, and you don't see a differential in pricing in the United States. My point here is tariffs have an impact. There are a lot of uncertainties that we're going to continue to see. There are 232 tariffs that are still up to come. 232 is related to national security tariffs. There's some on pharmaceuticals. There are some on steel products. They're still in the process. And as a result of that, we're going to see changes coming in the future. And there are even court appeals, for example, in the Court of International Trade on the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act in order to impose reciprocal tariffs. Unclear where that's going to go as well. We're going to see changes in the future. This is not the end of uncertainty. We're going to keep working through this together. And Andy, I bet we're going to have a conversation in the future.
I look forward to it. A great note to finish on, Carlos. Thank you so much for your time. And to all our listeners, look forward to our next episode of the Look Forward podcast. Thank you.